Finding female ancestors poses unique challenges that can throw roadblocks in your way. And the reason for that is really simple. The women in our family tree assume the surname of their husbands when they marry. Now, since in genealogy, we're researching backwards through time, we actually encounter their married surname first. So it's really critical that we locate the records that mention the woman's maiden name so that we can find her parents and continue to climb her family tree. Well, professional genealogist Shelley Bishop has come to the rescue in her new Family Tree magazine article. It's called Ladies in Waiting. And in that article, she covers 12 resources for discovering maiden names. And I'm happy to say that she's here to tell us about it right now. Hi, Shelley.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. This is a great article, and I think it's going to help so many people kind of bust through that roadblock that they run into. And it really is kind of a roadblock, isn't it?
It really can be. It can be a real challenge. And whether you've done a little bit of genealogy or a lot of research, it can definitely be a stumbling block for you.
Well, I love it. You've got 12 places for us to go and look. So take us to the first location. What's your first resource for finding maiden surnames?
Well, the first thing you're going to probably want to do is see if you can find a marriage record. I think that's probably the natural place to begin. And marriage records don't exist for all times and all places. So as you go back further in time, you may find that there aren't really marriage records. But if there are, that is going to definitely be the first place you want to look. Most marriage records could have been created at the local level. More recent ones often at the state level. And they will usually say the woman's maiden name on there. And there can be some other clues if it doesn't state it.
That's a great point. And kind of closely related to that are family records, right? The records that maybe she's been collecting over the years and you might even find in our own drawers and around our house.
Absolutely. Family sources can be amazing. You might find mention of a woman in a diary or letters. You might read letters and they might expose relationships and names that you weren't aware of or places that you weren't aware of. And it's also important to talk to some family members who might know a little more or who might have some of these family materials and keepsakes that you could look at and ask them if they'd be willing to talk with you and maybe share with you. Maybe you can copy some of their things. That's a great way to get a start.
Now, let's see here. You've got the family sources, the civil marriage records. What about religious records? I think you had that as number 3.
I did, yes. So when there isn't a record of a civil record of a marriage, there could still be a religious record of a marriage. So you would want to check church records and see what church records exist, again, for that time and place and where they might be held now, because that can change over time. And and there's a lot of different places too. You might look at the baptism records of children because those will often state the mother's maiden name. And again, these are church records. So there's a variety of church records that can help you.
And church records often go a lot farther back than the civil records, don't they?
Definitely. If you're lucky, they can go quite far back. And even in pioneer areas, sometimes a traveling preacher would keep his or her own records. And some of those little journals and so forth have been discovered and published now. So you can even find those.
Fantastic. So that's 3. Now, number 4, and you touched on the children. You have here children's vital records. So what are we looking for there?
Yes, children's vital records can be great. So we're looking at birth records of children if they exist. The marriage records of children sometimes will state the mother's maiden name, which is a real find. And the death records of a child may also state the maiden name. So those things are really, worth checking out. You want to look for records of all of the woman's children, not just the one that you're descended from. You want to look at all of her children that she had, even if they were by a different husband, because you just never know what you might find there. And if she had a child who died young, which is a sad situation, but that record may give the mother's maiden name, and it's a good place to look also.
Now, you mentioned looking at all the different children. Is that, I know for me and some of my families, I find that different children, whether they were born earlier or later in the woman's life, sometimes that surname kind of looks a little different on some of those. Is that the reason to look at all of them?
It does.
Variations on the name?
The spelling of the surname and everything can change. Sometimes the children weren't exactly sure how the surname was pronounced or spelled. They just knew it was sort of like something. So you will get variations. And so when you find those, just compare them between the different records, and be generous in your searching and try different variations, definitely, when you're conducting searches.
Yeah, I know. Even with my grandmother, she would say Mikulowski with an M, but it was Nikolowski with an N. So it's like
There
checking
you
every one of those
go.
records really helps find which is the most regularly used.
That's a great
All right.
example.
Yeah. So number 5, what have you got as our 5th resource for finding maiden names?
The 5th resource would be death records. And that would be both the death record of the woman herself, of course, but also, again, death records of the children, death records of her husband or husbands. They could provide her maiden name. And then if you find anyone else who is associated with her, I can't overstate the importance of doing whole family research, because women relied on other people in their lives, and they relied on men, especially. So their brothers-in-laws, their husbands, obviously, their fathers while their fathers were alive, and so forth. But those death records are something you're going to want to explore for everybody that you think she might have been associated with or that might have been related to her.
That's a great point, that cluster research.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine when we get to the point of finding her death record, that's a much later record. And she's not standing right there making sure the name gets written down correctly. So if we can find earlier death records of associated people, that sounds like maybe it might be more accurate.
Yes, that's true. And unfortunately, a lot of times, especially if a woman lived to enjoy ripe old age, they didn't even know her maiden name, and you'll find unknown on the line where it should be. So that's one of the things that we try to overcome. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's why this article is great. You're going to help us get past the unknown.
Exactly.
So number 6, I see here, cemetery sources. We're going to find maiden names in cemetery sources.
Yeah, so, gravestones don't give you a whole lot of information, just usually dates. But finding out, you can try to find out, like, are there records that the cemetery has, who purchased the plot that she's buried in, and that kind of thing, and who is she buried with. You can get great clues from seeing who she's buried with, and sometimes that's not apparent when you're just looking at a single gravestone record online. So if you can, I always recommend trying to go to the cemetery and see how those graves are positioned and see who she's buried with. Or you might find a published transcription that's been done by a society where the graves have not been put in alphabetical order. They've just been put in the order in which they were encountered when they were read. And that can also be another source of clues. So you can find, sometimes you can find a young child who's buried with his or her maternal grandparents. I had a big breakthrough that way one time, and that was the source of the maiden name. I knew this couple had a child. Unfortunately, she died young. She was buried with her mother's parents. So.
Gosh, it's amazing how many different ways you might just stumble into it like that. number 7, you have census records. And I think if she's living in her household with her husband, you might not see it there. How will census records help us?
So census records can help in a lot of other ways, especially if the woman is widowed later in
Ah,
life. Then she might be living with an adult son or adult daughter um, in the in the home of a son-in-law, for instance. And so that is a great way to find somebody. If you find a woman living in old age in with a, um, a man whose name you don't recognize, and then another person that could be a daughter, that's really a clue to investigate. Um, and likewise, if the woman herself died young, her children may have been taken in by her parents or her sister or something like that. So you may find if she died at age 36 or something like that, you may find her children living with her parents in another census record.
I've even seen by looking through the census records, and like you were talking about the cluster research of looking at all the different family members, seeing a name of a child either in her family or her sister's family, and that name really sounds like a surname. Like Conover was one I ran into. That was her maiden name, and it
Yeah.
was being used as a first name for other children in the extended family.
Yes, that does happen. Maiden names were used as first names. That was a pretty popular practice in
Yeah.
some areas. And it can be a clue to the mother's maiden name. It can also be a clue, believe it or not, to the grandmother's maiden name. Sometimes they would take it back
Yes.
a generation farther. So when you see a first name, I had someone named Greenman as the first name. His name was Greenman. Well, that's a surname, right? So I had to get work back to find the Greenman, and it ended up being two generations
Interesting.
the surname. But yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh my gosh. Okay. Oh, and number 8, one of my favorite record sources, newspapers. A good place
yeah.
to find maiden names.
Oh my gosh, that is a fantastic place. You would want to look, just depending on, again, the time period and the locality that you're working on, but you want to look for marriage announcements, which can vary anywhere from just a short little, social note to, a long, elaborate marriage announcement. Those will almost always say that the name of the bride, the full maiden name of the bride. And you can also look for golden anniversary announcements. If they've been married a long time, had a 50th anniversary, a lot of times they'll give a whole rundown of when and where they married and their parents. Sometimes they'll even name their parents, and they'll talk about people who attended the anniversary party, which could be her siblings. And the other things are social notices. If they went from out of town to visit relatives or something like that, you might find that. And of course, obituaries. And obituaries not only of the woman and her husband, but also her children. And again, anyone that you think might have been related to you, to her, anyone you think might have been her sister or her brother, try to find those. Newspapers are a great resource, and I know you've done a lot of work on them. Your book is a great guide to using newspapers.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh gosh, I just love them. And like you said, there's so many different types of articles that can have that information. Okay. So gosh, we're all the way up to number 9. What's number 9?
Number 9 is published sources. And those would include things like those old county and town histories, where they might talk about the early settlers of a region, who founded those, with the first members of the early churches. A lot of times you'll find women's names in there. And you also sometimes find a biographical sketch. Could be of her husband, her son, or her grandson, and that could be in a far distant city and state than where she ever lived. But you might find information there. And then published family histories are another place to look. A lot of times they will give the maiden names of women who married into the family. And then, of course, you have online family trees, which have to be taken with a little grain of salt, because that they're not always as well documented as we'd like them to be. And we have to be kind of careful about just accepting what they say. But that's true too of the published resources. We also have to verify that information. So in these kinds of sources, you definitely want to do additional research to verify, to either confirm or refute the information.
Right. Yeah. Very good point. All right. And number 10, court records.
Court records. So a woman's status when she was married historically, she was a femme covert, where she was literally covered by her husband's care. And she could not make any court decisions or any financial arrangements or anything like that in her own name. Her husband was in charge of all of that for her. Now, when she was widowed, then she could take care of her own affairs. But so estate records, you might want to look at estate records of a possible father. And those will usually name both her husband and herself in these estate records. And you'll want to look at, did they receive property? Were they named in a will? And so forth, like that. So you will often see a woman named with her husband in estate records. Guardianship records could have been created if the woman died while her children were still young. Guardianships were done to protect the property of the children against other people who might come later and try to claim that property, including a woman's future husbands. So they were to protect the children's interest in that. So guardianship records are another place to look. And then divorce records. If the woman got divorced, that you often find her maiden name in that, because they will go back to the original marriage and talk about that.
Oh, good point. Number 11, deeds. Interesting. We can find maiden names in deeds.
You can occasionally find maiden names in deeds, and sometimes if you can't find the maiden name, at least you can find good clues there. Again, if she had a father or a widowed mother who died and left property, sometimes there's not a will, and sometimes there's not a probate or estate file. In that case, you want to check the deeds, because if they owned property, it might have just passed down to the children without going through the courts. And if that's the case, then the children had to decide how to divide up the property, or they had to liquidate it. And so often some of them would sell their shares to another one, or they might also sell their shares to a third party. So you want to look in the deeds, and these are called quitclaim deeds, because the person is quitting, basically giving up their claim to their share of the property. So if you find a deed that has that word quitclaim in it, that's a good indication that there are other people who are invested in that property who also have an interest in it, and that you might be able then to find those people, find out how they're related, and then who owned the property that they are now dealing with.
Wow, you have terrific strategies. I mean, so many different creative ways to come at this problem of trying to find these maiden names. And the last one is one I would imagine a lot of people haven't thought of, but I agree with you. I think it's a great resource. Number 12, you have military pension records. Tell folks about that.
So if your mystery woman was married to someone who served in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, or the Civil War, you want to check to see if either the soldier or his widow applied for a pension after the fact, because those pension records can be a gold mine. You can learn so much from them. They're really, really interesting to read. So there's indexes to those, and I talk about those in the article, where to find those. And you can look for them, and you can order the entire file from the National Archives, or sometimes those files now some of them have been digitized. And you can look through it and see. In some cases, they will lay out exactly the woman's maiden name, when she was married. They'll name the children and their ages. It's just, you can really learn a lot. So,
well, we have really learned a lot from you. Gosh, Shelley, I think you've kind of smashed the idea that, we just have to be stuck by not knowing a woman's maiden name. There are so many other places to go and look. And with some little bit of diligent effort, I think we have a really good chance of success. Of course, we've been talking about Shelley's strategies, these 12 strategies she goes into in detail in her article, Ladies in Waiting. It's in the March-April issue of Family Tree Magazine. And you can find Shelley Bishop at buckeyefamilytrees.com. It's been so fun to catch up with you and talk about this topic. I hope you'll come back again soon. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate you having me. And I just want to tell everybody, keep at it, keep searching, and best of luck with finding those maiden names.